Thanks, Amy. Amy's also a teacher at the same school where Ruby and Caitlin go to high school. And a student, I think, saw on Ruby's Instagram Mrs. Hunter drowning Ruby from the baptism photo from here. And so that's raised a whole bunch of other questions at school. She still has her teacher registration active. It wasn't a drowning, it was a baptism. So it's all okay. But Ruby's baptism has led on to other questions and other people seeking faith. And obviously we are celebrating Caitlin's story this morning. I know that I'm probably going to lose about 50% of you straight away as I say this, but I love watching sport. It's a way that I love to unwind and relax. I didn't enjoy it so much on Wednesday night, but there's probably a couple of you here that did enjoy that on Wednesday night, and you're going to cheer right now. Yeah, one person likes New South Wales. The rest of us are true and faithful to Queensland. That's great. On the whole, I do like watching sport. One of the things that I like doing is that in hindsight, after a game, or maybe even as you're watching the game, I'm looking for what's the turning point in the match. Is there some kind of decisive moment? And it becomes crystal clear after the game often, but we're looking for it in the game. I might be looking for, is there a spot where one player kind of rises to the top and just dominates and leads? Or is there kind of, unfortunately sometimes, a referee's call and that is a turning point in the game? Or is there a sub at just the right moment where the coach or whatever brings on the right player at the right time with this message or with this move or whatever it is, and it's a turning point in the game? We have turning points in our lives as well, don't we? Maybe if you've ever tried to go on a diet or you've gone to the gym and you're wanting to lose weight or put on muscle mass or whatever it might be, you do that for a certain amount of time and you might then start to notice a difference. And it's a turning point. You look at yourself in the mirror and go, I already knew I looked good, but now I look really good. Or that weight that I was hoping to come off, it's coming off. And you can see it, and it's a turning point, and you keep going. It happens in relationships too, doesn't it? Maybe with colleagues or friends or whatever, you get some kind of experience or some kind of conversation that takes that relationship to a deeper level. You've like bonded over some shared experience or whatever it might be, and it becomes a turning point in the relationship. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be preaching from just some chapters in Luke's story of Jesus' life. And it kind of leads up to and then follows on what happens after a turning point in his ministry. Where we're going to read from today, a lot of Jesus' early ministry was in and around the area of Galilee. And when as we approach this turning point in his ministry, it's not just going to be Jesus' ministry to those in Galilee. It's going to be a mission that leads him to Jerusalem. But it's going to be a mission that his disciples join him on. No longer is it just his mission, but it's their mission. They're in it together. In these kind of chapters that we're going to look at, they're going to discover that the one they'd be looking for, Jesus is the one. And so as Jesus teaches them what it means to be his followers on the road to Jerusalem, on his mission, as they join him on that mission, he's going to lead them in what does it mean to be his disciple. And we'll get time and time again the invitation from Jesus, not just to his disciples then, but to his followers now. And perhaps even some of us that are exploring faith will get Jesus' invitation to come, to follow, and to go and do likewise. For a number of years at Rivers, we've used the play symbol to kind of talk about this. There's this idea as you look at the play symbol that it reminds us, it's not like a logo of our church or anything, it just reminds us that we're called to be people who worship, who respond to God. It's kind of at the top, and even though God's not necessarily up, he's all around by his Spirit, we respond to him, we hear from him, we're obedient to God and his calling on our life. We're filled by the Holy Spirit to do that. We're reminded as well by the play symbol that we're part of a community, that being worshippers, living lives as followers of Jesus, we're not disconnected. We're not isolated. We don't have to do it on our own. God gives us a community of people to live life with. We're connected with the family of God right throughout the world, but here, in this place, we've got brothers and sisters, family and friends, people we're connected with as we worship and as we mission together. And it's a play symbol because we want all three to be together. We recognise also that we live on mission, that we're a community of people who mission together. When you press play, they're interconnected. When you press play, we can't worship God without being part of a community, without representing who God is among our neighbours. We are a worshipping community, part of what Jesus is doing here and now. And so what we want to do this morning, as we go through these next few weeks and look at these stories from Luke's Gospel, is kind of press play, to go and to do likewise, as responsive worshippers, obedient to Jesus' call in our life, with each other, to go and live like Jesus in our neighbourhood. Does that kind of make sense so far? So as we begin this morning, what we want to do is start at a very famous sermon of Jesus. And as we read through these words in just a moment, they're going to sound familiar. And you go, plagiarism? Luke's just ripped all his stuff from Matthew's Gospel. We've got a sermon that we're about to read, or part of the sermon today, that's going to sound a lot like the Sermon on the Mount. If you've read that in Matthew chapter 5, 6 and 7, the words that we start going through today in Luke chapter 6, you're going to go, this rings a bell. This sounds very similar. We're going to hear Luke's unique angle, his particular perspective on Jesus' sermon. He's going to be emphasising certain things for the people that he's writing to. And so as we start our journey, as we're looking towards this turning point, or maybe even experiencing a turning point in our lives or our life as a church, we're seeking to go and do. Here's where it all begins in Luke chapter 6. Jesus says this, or this is how Luke records this famous sermon of Jesus. He went down with them and stood on a level place. A large crowd of his disciples was there, and a great number of people from all over Judea, from Jerusalem, and from the coastal region around Tyre and Sidon. And they'd come to hear him to be healed of their diseases. Those troubled by impure spirits were cured, and the people all tried to touch him because power was coming from him and healing them all. Prior to this, in verse 12, Jesus has been up a mountain. He's been praying throughout the night. He'd called his disciples up to him. And the way that Luke tells the story is that now he and his disciples head down the mountain onto a flat place, like a plain. And this is where he starts his sermon. And so if you're a bit of a Bible nerd, or you're just trying to understand, is the Bible being inconsistent here? Matthew said that this sermon that we're about to read happened up on a mountain. Luke's now saying that this kind of sermon that we're reading is happening down on a level plain. Which one was it? Was it up the mountain? Was it down kind of on the plain? Is this just poetic license? It actually happened down on the plain, but Matthew puts it up on a mountain. Or did Jesus preach it at both places? We'll see in Matthew's Gospel that he's writing to a mainly Jewish audience. And so when he records Jesus' famous sermon, he's emphasising how Jesus is like topping up, filling full the righteous requirements of the law. He's trying to show us, like he's discovered, that Jesus is Moses 2.0. Jesus is the lawgiver and the interpreter of the law, and Jesus is like this Moses figure, and he emphasises that. As we'll read, Luke is writing to a mainly Gentile kind of audience, Greek-speaking people. And so the Old Testament law perhaps doesn't mean what it does to them as it does to Israel. But the image of a God coming down from the clouds, down from the mountain to be among the people, that resonates, that connects. And so Luke emphasises that in his sermon. I think it's very likely that Jesus taught this sermon on numerous occasions. If you're one of the disciples, you could probably say it word for word or very similar to Jesus, because he would preach it in lots of different places. And I think what we're seeing here is that he probably did preach it up on a mountain. He probably did preach it down on a plain. And the way that it's recorded in these Gospels helps to emphasise different things different people. And so now Jesus, as it's pictured by Luke, coming down from the mountain, he's coming to be with the people. There's Gentiles amongst the crowd, people from the coastal regions, non-Jewish people. He is the one who is coming down to them, and he's got a message about his kingdom. And here's how the sermon goes. You'll recognise some of these words. If you've studied it in Matthew before, it's very similar as we're going to read through it in Luke's Gospel in chapter 6, verse 20. Looking at his disciples, he said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you, insult you, and reject your name as evil because of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, because great is your reward in heaven. For that is how their ancestors treated the prophets." If you know Matthew's version of these blessings, these are a little bit different, aren't they? Matthew has more. This is a bit less. This is kind of like the how you would do it on Twitter or whatever it's called now, where you've got to do it in 40 characters or less. This is the condensed down version. And we notice as we read on that the way Luke arranges it, the way he recalls this, is a little bit different. As we go on in verse 24, we'll notice that Matthew never said anything about woes or warnings, but Luke records that Jesus did say this in verses 24 to 26. "But woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you will go hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when everyone speaks well of you, for that is how their ancestors treated the false prophets." I think it's helpful in some ways that Luke records that this is one of the ways that Jesus presented the sermon. And if, in fact, you put those blessings and woes side by side, it paints a really interesting picture. If you are poor, you receive the kingdom. If you're rich now, you've already received your reward. If you're hungry, Jesus says you will be filled. If you're full now, you will go hungry. Putting it side by side, if you're weeping now, Jesus says you will laugh. If you're laughing now, you will mourn and weep. If you're hated now, you're like the prophets of old. And you'll receive a reward in heaven. If you're spoken well of now, well then you're like the false prophets of old. So what's Jesus' point? Why is it being put side by side in comparison like this? Well, number one, Jesus is not saying that being blessed is contingent on our behaviour. He's not saying that if you act in a certain ethical, moral way and your behaviour is up to standard, then this is the blessing that you can receive. Jesus is not saying that. Nor is he saying that if you're laughing now, if you had a little cheeky laugh on the way to church this morning, if you had a well-fed breakfast this morning, if you've got a bit of money in the bank, Jesus isn't saying if you've got those things now that they're necessarily bad things. You're allowed to laugh. Thirdly, these are not suggestions of how we are to live. Jesus is not saying that what we should necessarily do is at all times try and go about as though we're mourning and weeping and crying. I think one of the things that becomes obvious when you put them side by side is that there's some now and not yet phrases that are included in here. Jesus says, if you are poor, yours is the kingdom. That seems to be a now and now kind of statement. He also says, if you are rich now, you have received your comfort. And so that's a now and now kind of statement. But as it goes down, it has this kind of now but not yet ring to what Jesus is saying. If you hunger now, Jesus says, there will be a time that you are satisfied. But if you're well fed now, there will be a time where you go hungry. If you're weeping now, you will laugh. But for those who are laughing now, you will mourn and weep. In the New Testament, when you read things like this that talk about now but not yet in connection with Jesus' kingdom, it's got this ring of the end is coming, that Jesus has begun his kingdom, he's inaugurated his kingdom, he's announced his kingdom, and yet there's a time when we're expecting Jesus to return and we'll be part of his kingdom in full. Look at the line that Jesus in fact says, "Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, because great is your reward in heaven." Jesus is making a statement of fact. He's making a proclamation about life, whether you're inside his kingdom or outside his kingdom. That irrespective of your status, there's an opportunity, there's an invitation to be part of his kingdom, no matter who you are. And there's a warning here as well, isn't there? That if you think you've made it, if you think you've got it good in this life, but you're outside the kingdom, then what you've got now is a warning, isn't there? That you may not always have that. There's a warning here that despite what looks like riches and success and favour in this life, if we haven't responded to Jesus' invitation to be part of his kingdom, we may discover and find ourselves on the outer. The blessings of the reality of life with Jesus in his kingdom, we'll see glimpses of them now. We'll see moments where we experience the goodness of who he is and the riches of that here and now. But there's a day coming. We rejoice and we look forward to this day coming, where everything that is being prepared in heaven, that we will receive, that will participate in that and be part of that. The blessings of Jesus and his kingdom is good news. And the way Jesus tells it here, it's especially good news for the poor, for the hungry, for the weeping, and for the scorned. When injustice reigns now, Jesus is saying the world will be turned right again. If it feels like everything is the wrong way up, the wrong way down, whatever it is right now, if things feel unjust and unfair, there is coming a day where he will make it right again. And the least, the last, the lost, the weeping, the hungry, the mourning, they're rejoicing and looking forward and anticipating that day where there will be restoration and vindication and peace. Where we experience, and this is not just in the past, this is here and now today, where we experience violence in our world, where we know there are class distinctions, where some people get wealthy at the expense of putting others down, where there's authority systems or systems of power in place that take advantage and manipulate and abuse the vulnerable. Jesus is saying that there is a new way possible that we can begin living now that will come to fruition in the future. There's a group of Christians in America. They began a project called He Gets Us. What they want to do is just get little 30-second to 1-minute ads out on YouTube and social media, and sometimes they've even paid for Super Bowl ads. You know, they cost millions of dollars, I think, to get a 30-second ad in the Super Bowl, and their aim is to get the message of Jesus out, that he gets you, that he understands what life's like, and that Jesus has come to bring in a new way of living. We're going to watch one of those ads right now, just a very short one, 30 seconds, a little taste of what the world could be like when people encounter and experience Jesus. Thanks, mate.
Hate is loud. It uses all its breath and then some to shout its selfish causes and to spew its vile venom. It's obsessed with division and distress, with its gain and its success at another one's expense. Hate is loud, but love is louder. It is patient, it is kind, it is gentle, but it is strong. But it's a different kind of sound. It doesn't shout or raise its voice. It's love's whisper that is loud. A whisper like a song, or like the rushing of the wind. It reverberates and resonates. It amplifies within. Love is louder.
people that Jesus was talking to, they're flocking to him because he's got a message which is good news for poor and vulnerable and those who are being scorned and mocked and experiencing violence and all kinds of stuff. We see that kind of thing happening in our world right now. Perhaps for some of us, we're feeling like the political or social environment at the moment it's heated, it's tense. Perhaps we look at the different things that are happening around the world at the moment. We look at that and it creates a little bit of stress, or there's anxiety there for us, or maybe even fear that we're not sure what's going to happen tomorrow. We're not sure who's going to blow up who, or whatever it might be. And in us, there could be that kind of tension. And so as we come to Jesus, maybe we identify with some of the statements he said before. Perhaps we don't, but we're just noticing what's going on in the world at the moment, and there's a little bit of tension or anxiety or fear. We want to look at Jesus' next words to this unlikely group of people who are hanging on his every word. They're coming to be healed. They're hearing that he's setting free the oppressed and the poor, that's the aim, that's the goal, that's the restoration, that's the future. How do we live right now in the face of what we see around us? If someone's mocking you, if someone's scorning you, if someone's right up in your face, if someone's hurting you, what is the response here and now? And Jesus gives some very clear instructions. He says this in Luke chapter 6, verses 27 to 31. To you who are listening, these are the ones that perhaps are the poor, the ones who have been scorned, the ones who have been mistreated. To you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on the cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. For Jesus' followers, he says, do not reciprocate. In a state of origin match, you have to reciprocate, don't you? If you're up in your mate's face, you've got to get in there and reciprocate. In fact, they don't just reciprocate, they go one up, don't they? That's the way that things work. You hurt me or you hurt my friends, so I'm going to do what they did to you back, but a little bit more. Jesus says, in the kingdom of God, for you, the unlikely group of people sitting at my feet listening, Jesus says to them, do not reciprocate, do not retaliate. Don't copy the victimization tactics of those who mistreated you. Jesus gives some examples. He says, if someone slaps you on the cheek, turn the other cheek. Back in Jesus' day, your left hand was used for left-handed things, such as, you get the idea. So you didn't touch anyone with your left hand. That was just for wipey, bottomy, or whatever it might be. But you'd use your right hand for all kinds of things in public. If you were an equal with someone and you had a fight or an argument with them, you would hit them with your right hand open-handed, or you might even punch them, because equals would do that. If someone was beneath you, or if you wanted to oppress someone, if you wanted to victimize someone, you would backhand slap them across the face. Jesus is saying, if you've been backhand slapped across the face and you turn the other cheek and you can't use this hand, what have they got to do now? You've got to hit them like an equal. You've got to punch them like an equal. This is not a weak position. Jesus is not saying be a doormat. Jesus is saying it's a strong and courageous thing to love your enemy. To bring the shamefulness of their actions on them by turning the other cheek and inviting them to hit you like an equal. Jesus said, if someone steals your coat, give them your shirt also. They didn't wear shirts like we do now. Their shirts kind of were full length. So let's just imagine what's going on. They've stolen your coat. What do you give them? You give them your tunic, your shirt as well. What are you now in public? You are naked, aren't you? It was shameful to be naked in public, but it was even more shameful to look upon a naked person in public. Jesus is saying, if someone takes your coat, take off all your clothes, and you are literally exposing them to the shamefulness of their actions. This is not a weak thing that Jesus is saying. It's courageous to, in the face of victimization, in the face of mistreatment, to say, I am equal with you, and I'm standing before you, and I will not be treated like this. Exposing them to the shamefulness of their actions. When we act like that, is Jesus saying we literally go and take off our clothes? I think what Jesus is saying is that we act in ways that undo, that disarm the shameful actions of those who are treating us or others. Jesus says, it's the attitude that he's developing in us. If we're going to go and do likewise, Jesus says we can learn to love our enemies, to treat others how we would want to be treated. And that if we are being mistreated, don't become a victim. Don't be shaped by what they've done to you. Take the initiative. Stand up for what is right. Don't retaliate. Choose now. Let's choose now, before this happens, that if this happens, we are going to act. We're going to take the initiative. We're going to act in ways that we would want to be treated. We're going to treat others how we ourselves would want to be treated. To act according to the kingdom principles of love and forgiveness and generosity. Sounds simple and obvious, doesn't it? Love your enemy. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. But it's so scarce in our world, isn't it? As we pursue this, if this is Jesus' invitation for us, how can we live like this? This sounds simple, but we know in practice that if someone's up in your face, what's the natural reaction of us? We want to get bigger, or we want to run away. If someone's up in our face, we want to get the fists out. We want to get angry. How can we begin to live in this kind of gracious and loving God-like way? Well, it comes out in the next series of verses, in verses 32 to 36. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you go do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those who you expect repayment from, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners and expect to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting anything back. And then your reward will be great, and you'll be children of the Most High God, because he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. There it is. And so be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. The paradigm of this world is, if you treat me well, I'll treat you well. If you have a go at me, then I'll have a go at you. That's the way we do things in the world, and Jesus is undoing that and saying there's a brand new way possible where, irrespective of whether you do me good or whether you do harm, that we can, because God is kind and generous, we can begin to learn to act like that to anyone else, no matter what. Whether it's our family, our friends, or whether it's to our enemies, that Jesus says there's a new way of life possible where we can treat others how we would want to be treated, because God treated like us that first. We know that in Jesus' life that he allowed them to take the shirt off his back. We know that he was beaten and hipped. He turned the other cheek. He wept over the city that had rejected him. And in light of all the generous blessings and goodness of God, Jesus was able to do the most uproarious, absurd and generous act of all, to be exceptionally loving to absolutely everyone, whether they deserved it or not. And Jesus is saying to the unlikely group of people sitting at his feet, you can learn to live like this too. Jesus finishes. This is the last bit we'll say for today, and then Graham's going to continue on in our next sermon in this series. Jesus continues. This is what it might look like. Verse 37. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured. Sounds a little bit like prosperity doctrine. The more you're generous to others, the more God's going to reward you. The image actually here that Jesus is talking about is like filling up a big sack of grain, or using the part of your tunic above the belt to kind of hold it up, and pours in and it spills out into your lap. Jesus is saying, if we test the generosity of God, if we can be generous and radical and loving in the way that we treat others, see how much that reveals the loving kindness and generosity of God, overflowing, spilling out into your life, into those around you. I like going and watching the person making coffee. When I order a coffee and they get this thing, it's called the portafilter. Did I get it right, Graham? Portafilter, there we go. A stingy barista turns off the grinder when it's just a little bit below the rim, don't they? And then they tamp it down, and you kind of get a really weak shot of coffee, don't you? And they're happy with that because they're stingy. And they'll just put a little bit in there and they'll tamp it down for you, and they'll give you a stingy, tiny, puny one shot of coffee. And it doesn't put hairs on anything on your body, does it? If you go watch a generous barista, have you seen what they do? They leave it under the grinder until it's mounded up and it's overflowing and there's a mess on the bench. And then they tamp that down and give you a really generous, filling, full, rich cup of coffee that comes through that. Jesus is saying to us, the invitation to us this morning, allow the generosity of who he is spilling over into your lap. Allow that to shape and guide the way that we treat others, even those who mistreat us. That would have a disarming effect on our world, wouldn't it? I don't think yet, maybe, that Christians have enemies here in Australia. Jesus is offering these words to people who are perhaps poor because of Jesus. They're being mistreated because of Jesus. I don't think we experience that here in Australia. But I think perhaps there are people that we recognise in our world, in our neighbourhood, that think and live and act differently to us. We do know there are people in our lives who maybe have hurt us. We know there are people in our lives who have used and abused power over us. How do we treat those people? Jesus says, look at the loving, generous, overflowing grace and kindness that God has poured into your life, and learn the rhythms of Jesus. Follow in his steps. Go and do likewise. In the violent scene, where some teachers of law have brought a woman before them, they took the vulnerable person in that situation. There was two people that had an affair, and they brought the adulterous woman before Jesus. It's a heated scenario, isn't it? It's a hate-filled kind of scenario. And Jesus does something really, really profound. If you're in a situation like that where there's aggressiveness and there's people being violent, I'm sure if you do police training or whatever it is, you need to be big. You need to be strong. You need to be assertive. Jesus takes the decision to lower himself and to get down into the dirt. That's a vulnerable position to be in. That's where you can be struck from. Jesus gets in a position, he lowers himself in a way which allows that moment to be disarmed. The aggressors, those who have come to strike and hit and to hurt, they leave. And it's just Jesus left with this woman. Jesus is inviting us that the generous, overflowing grace and kindness of God that's been poured out into our laps, that we can begin, as difficult as it might seem, to begin treating others as we would want to be treated, not as they deserve. If that was to happen in Launton, Strathpine, Bray, wherever you live, wherever you go each day in the city to work, we would begin to see, little bit by little bit, a little bit less violence in our world. That at least on our part, when people are having a go at each other, that it would stop with us. There wouldn't be revenge or retaliation. There'd be no division. There'd be no us and them. There'd be no classes of people. Our property and our possessions wouldn't be a way that I feel good about myself. And in fact, my property and possessions wouldn't be as important as just making sure that my neighbour is doing okay. So Jesus invites us to imagine what life could be like if we were to live like him. It'd be exuberant, it'd be different, it'd be astonishing. People would stop and they'd stare. So the invitation this morning, let's go and do likewise. Jesus, we thank you for the way that you demonstrate so clearly the loving kindness, the fantastic generosity, the undeserved nature of the kindness that you demonstrate for all people. Jesus, the more we get a fathom of that, the more we get a glimpse of that, the more we kind of wrap our brains around that, your invitation is for us to become like you, to live in that, to exist in that new kingdom reality, to be insiders on that, and to point the people of our world to this new and fantastic way of living. Jesus, right now I'm sure there's a situation or a person that comes to mind, and we've been slighted, we've been hurt, we're in the vulnerable position, maybe we've been taken advantage of. Jesus, as we pause and think about that unique situation for us right now, lead us, Holy Spirit. How do we respond? How do we live like you in that particular scenario? Jesus, help us to be responsive to you this morning. In your name, amen.